Hey, welcome to the Coalesce podcast. My name's Grant.
And I'm Meg.
And we're going to dive in today into how do we fix, Meg, go ahead and show them that in this question editor, when you hit the question editor, there's a drop down and it refers to it's a foreign key for the correct answer. And we want it to only take answers from the child records that are associated to this question, right? So we only want to grab the records that have a foreign or a parent, in this case, a foreign key of the question that we're actually working with. And so this is a really common use case, and Coalesce does handle this. We just want to show you how to do that. So Meg, you want to talk about just a little bit about the kind of fundamental piece that we use in Coalesce in order to make this happen?
Yeah, so the fundamental piece Grant is talking about is you can control the way that you retrieve data with something called a data source. So when you think about Coalesce, its main job is to get items for you, put items or save items, create items, or delete items, and kind of all the stuff that goes around that. And the data sources are the main component to customize the way that you get stuff.
Awesome. So we need to make a data source that's going to look at what the ID of the parent question is and hand that to the query that is going to be executed to grab back the list of correct answers.
Yep. So to do that, let's start by heading over to the backend here, which is where we're going to define our data sources. And since we're doing this for the answers, we want to open up the answers model, because we want to pull back the correct answers given the correct question. So we're going to write a filter on here. So down here, you can make a new class, and you can kind of call this whatever you want. But the way that I typically name these is I name it whatever I'm doing. So answers for, if I can spell that right, for question. And then I put data source at the end, just to note that this is a data source.
So we know what it is. Yep, great.
And then this IntelliSense and Copilot don't seem to be helping very much. But this is going to take in a CRUD context. And if you're not familiar with the CRUD
you could have done that by inheritance. So if you take the inheritance first, it's going to show you that you have to take that in.
Yeah.
So you don't have to know that. If you just do the colon, and you'd be in pretty good shape right there.
Yeah. So if we did this first, and now it's kind of getting there. This doesn't take in just an answer. This also takes in an appdb context. So you're going to type it as answer appdb context. Takes in two types. And then this, you can kind of see it's going to maybe help now. It's almost right. I called my context instead of appdb context, but it would have gotten close.
Okay, so what's going on there is we are deriving another child context from the standard data source, right? So we have this, not another context, a data source from the standard data source. So the standard data source does all your things like filtering and sorting and searching and all the things that you normally get. And we want to extend that with some kind of custom code here. And so we're literally just inheriting and making a new one of these. So it's pretty straightforward. And you can see you don't have to guess on this CRUD context. And all the CRUD context is the CRUD context is the thing that allows access to the EF model. And so it does all the things. So you can actually override that as well. If you need to do some things at a little more base level, but we've tried to create some really nice structures in here to allow you to do that in a simple way and not have to get down into all the details.
Yeah, and this is kind of what that standard data source class looks like. So as you can kind of see what it does there.
You can override most of the things in there.
Yeah, another way to kind of check that is if you just came over here, override, and then you'll kind of see all the stuff that you can override. So there's a lot of stuff that you can override and customize. One of the most common things to override is the get query. And there's a get query and a get query async. But if you're not doing any async stuff, which we're not, then go ahead and do this. And this is kind of the way that you customize the stuff that you retrieve. So you can see this is calling the base get query. All base get query is doing for the standard data source is it's basically just doing db answers, right? And that's about it.
Right, but it's also handling the parameters, any parameters that you pass in. So there are some parameters. If you want to pass those in, those are also handled by that base data source too. So
yeah, and then if you ever were to override any of your standard data sources, I personally like to always call get query just because it always makes it easier when you inevitably override your standard data source to do something else.
Yes, and what it does, it gives you kind of that base functionality that the get query provides. So anything that you're just going to pass in that's just standard stuff, you can handle that, and then you can elaborate on that on top. So now in this case, we want to pass in a specific parameter that is our question ID, right? So I mean, I suppose we could pass that in kind of as a dynamic parameter or something like that, but we don't want to do that. We want to actually have a first class parameter that is typed correctly and all that. So what's the process for doing that?
Yeah, so this is a class. You can kind of treat it like a class, and you can just put a property up here, public string question ID, and we'll make it nullable because it could technically be undefined if you're just calling this class and not setting it up. So when you make this class on your front end, you can actually just do the dot operator and set your question ID. Now, the only other key thing here is that you need to tell Coalesce to generate code for this by noting it with this Coalesce tag. Right. You don't need to do that for your data sources, to be clear, because these are always going to be generated for Coalesce. But you do need to. Yeah.
And the reason it's going to be generated is because it's a class inside of the answer class. If you don't put it inside the answer class, you have to do some annotations. So it'll pick it up here, and you just put it right in line, and away you go. And the reason that Coalesce attribute is there is because you may have other properties on there that you want to have that aren't actually exposed. And so that Coalesce argument basically or the Coalesce attribute just says, hey, go ahead and generate code for this so you can see it externally.
Yeah, it's just a nice way to be explicit about it, rather than Coalesce trying to guess what you do and do not want exposed.
And so now we probably just need to do a quick null check on question and then hand back something depending. So if question ID is null, we probably just want to hand back just the base get query parameters, right?
Yeah, we could do that. We could either do that, or we could just always check against question ID and return back nothing, but that might not be desirable. So it kind of depends how you want to set this up. So we can say if question ID is null, and let's go ahead and put this in a query parameter. Then we're
in this case, we can just check for not null and then do the query in this case if this is
that's true. Yeah, and then down here we can say query, and then we're just do a where question ID equals question ID. And it should be.
And you will have to assign that.
Yep. Yeah, there we go. That would have been annoying. Okay, yeah, so that's all you got to do.
So we grab our query, our base query out of there. We then go in and add the where clause, and you could add whatever you wanted. Like if you wanted to include more things, you could do some more includes on there. If you wanted to do a where clause, you could do that. If you wanted to, I mean, the data has to come back in fundamentally the same shape, so it needs to still be an iQueryable answer. So you can't just like reshape it. Now there are ways to reshape your data, and we'll show you how to do that with some services and different things of that nature. But in this case, as long as you're handing back an iQueryable answer, you can do a lot of different things. You can do some searching and sorting and those kinds of things. If you want to do that.
Yeah, and that's a good thing to note too, is that this is returning an iQueryable. So don't go in here and don't do toList or anything like that. Always try to in your data sources avoid executing the query if you can. Sometimes it's really hard not to if you have a super complex query, but it's good not to if you can handle it, because Coalesce then after you do this query will go and handle paging and stuff like that. So you want to avoid any kind of execution of the query here. Okay, so now we have to actually generate some Coalesce code. So let's go ahead and open up a terminal.
And make sure you save that file too.
Yeah, saving is important. I seem to keep forgetting to do that. Sorry, just getting to spot here. So we're going to go over to our web directory and .NET Coalesce, and that should generate a couple of files for us. Here we go. Okay, So that's all generated. Now we want to head back to our front end. And we can actually start this as well, because we're just going to start doing front end stuff. And I believe it is our question editor. Yep. So this is the input that is in question here. Just let that start up, or well, while we're letting that start up and start writing code. So right down here, the first thing we want to do is we want to define that new data source so that we can pass some parameters into it. So let's do that. So we're just going to make a variable called, I guess we'll just call it the same thing we called it over there. Answers for question data source equals new. And then to get this new data source, you're going to have to grab it from the answer model itself. And then that's going to be under data sources and under the actual data source name there. And let me make this bigger. There we go. So this is going to instantiate your new data source. And then all you have to do is on here, you can do question ID equals set ID. And this will set that question ID that we have defined over here to the ID that we have coming into this page.
Right. In this case, we only have to do it once because as the page loads, we already know what the ID is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if it was something dynamic, we'd have to use a little different thing in order so that we know when these changes happen.
Yep. Okay. So here we can see all the questions still coming back. To fix that, we can come up to our CInput that is in charge of showing that data. And CInput has a params option. And then on here, it just takes basically a little options object. And data source, you can pass the whole data source in as a parameter. And there, good, that reformatted nicely. So that's just referencing the thing I made down here.
And it updated immediately on the left. That was cool.
That was cool. I didn't think it would actually do that. I thought I'd have to close the thing first, but hot reload is very nice. So yeah, now you can see these are just the answers for this question, which makes it a lot easier to pick the correct answer. And it should be working for Canada as well. So there you go.
Oh, that was great. Awesome. All right, do we want to talk about data sources are probably one of the things you're going to use the most as far as being able to limit the data coming back. And let's just kind of answer the question, well, what happens if you want to always apply a data source? Like, let's say you want to always either include or not include like child records and things like that. What would that look like in that particular case? Because if we want to just make it so that rather than having to make it explicit, we could just implicitly use a data source all the time.
Yeah, so if you want to just implicitly use a data source all the time, there's a very nifty tag called default data source. And as soon as you put this on here, you'll have to regen your Coalesce code. But that means that the default data source that Coalesce uses is just, it looks just like this, except it's just this get query and none of this stuff and none of this stuff, right? I mean, it just pulls back everything. If you put your default data source tag on this data source, then this is the data source it will always use. It won't actually look any different because of the way we've written this. It will look like it behaves the same way, but you'll have this question ID on it as well. Let's say that you wrote another data source where you were including something. So by default, that would always be included whenever you called load. Something important to know too is with data sources, you can have multiple data sources. So you don't have to commit to just a single data source, which is actually different than the way that behaviors work in Coalesce, which we'll talk about later. But you can write as many data sources as you want. You can only have one default data source, though, so you can only put this tag on one of them.
Right. And the reason to have multiple data sources would be, let's say you have a complex data model and there's a page where you want to actually bring back a lot of data and a lot of child data, and you have to do a lot of includes. And we've had cases where we're pulling back like 10 different tables along with that information in one big JSON payload. So you can just display it and edit it and do all the things. But then you have another page where you just want it to load really fast, right? You don't need all that payload coming back. And so you have a data source that has a whole lot more things that are included, and that's going to go back with the payload. And then you may have another one that's just literally nothing. It just loads the object itself and doesn't load any children. And so those are really the key times when you want to be able to do that. Like in this case, we wouldn't even need to hand back. Like it automatically goes one layer deep. And so we could even explicitly say, hey, don't load in those other things. So those are really the use cases for doing data sources and filtering. And if you're doing something like you want to do security trimming and you want to use a default data source, that's a good way to do it because it'll always use that default data source if you want to do some of those security type things as well. So
yeah, super handy if you have any kind of login or auth where you can check claims and stuff with your data sources.
Awesome. Anything else we want to cover on data sources?
I think that's it for data sources. Maybe next video we can go over C loaders and some more front end stuff with Coalesce.
Nice. Yeah, so you can kind of get that nice little loading effect on there. So great. Well, until next time, keep building awesome websites with Coalesce.